Good afternoon. Let's get started. Thanks everyone for being here today for this webinar presented by Behavioral Economics in Action at Rotman in partnership with the Behaviorally Informed Organizations Partnership. This is our sixth webinar of this academic year. My name is Liz Kang. I am a research coordinator and the knowledge translation specialist at the BIOrg Research Center and the moderator for today's webinar. Behavioral Economics in Action at Rotman, or BIOrg, is a research center at the University of Toronto's Rotman School of Management, whose three programmatic missions are to research, educate, and engage in meaningful outreach with our academic, governmental, and industry partners. These monthly webinars are our way to hear firsthand from academics and practitioners who are making a meaningful impact in the world of behavioral insights, in particular, behaviorally informed business and evidence-based public policy. We're delighted today to have Mariam Chammat, an executive advisor at the French Behavioral Insights Unit within the Interministerial Directorate for Public Transformation. Before I introduce Mariam, I would like to go over the ground rules for this webinar. Following this introduction, our speaker will deliver a 30 to 35-minute presentation. And during the presentation, please submit your questions for our speaker by clicking the chat tab at the right-hand side of your WebEx screen and typing into the entry box. These questions will be visible to all of the participants. And at the end of the talk, and with time permitting, we will have a question and answer session in which I will select questions from the chat tab to ask our speaker. Without further ado, I would like to introduce Mariam. Mariam is an executive advisor at the French Behavioral Insights Unit within the Interministerial Directorate for Public Transformation. Her work consists in translating findings and methods from cognitive and behavioral sciences into improvements in public policies. Mariam also works on strengthening evidence-based policy making by developing and piloting projects between policymakers and researchers. Mariam holds a PhD in affective and cognitive neuroscience and has co-founded a think tank that aims at translating findings on cognitive biases into tools that can help improve people's mental habits and their metacognitive skills. Thank you, and Mariam, for being here today, and take it away.
Great, thank you very much, Liz. So I hope you can hear me well. Is the volume okay on your side? Okay,
yeah,
perfect.
We can hear you.
Okay, great. So thank you very much for the invitation to talk in this webinar, and it gave me a very good opportunity to talk about things which I don't usually talk about. And so today, instead of presenting to you the work we do or the projects we're doing in the French Behavioral Insights team, I decided to talk about a topic that I'm very interested in, and I think doesn't get addressed very often in this field, which is what kind of theoretical frameworks and underpinnings are we talking about when we talk about behavioral sciences that inform behavioral insights? So this is what I'm going to be talking about for the next 30 minutes. And but I'm still going to tell you where I come from, what the French Behavioral Insights team or unit does before getting into the gist of the topic. So first of all, sorry, I'm just going to. There you go. I come from a very small team sitting at, as you said, at DITP, which I'll present in a bit. So our team is made of 6 different members with different backgrounds, but we also work on a lot of our projects with the Behavioral Insights team and also a French consortium of researchers called Agence d'Innovation Comportementale that accompany us throughout all of our projects. So if you want to have at one glance an idea about our team, as you were saying, Liz, we are inside the DITP, the Directorate for Interministerial Transformation, and basically it's an interministerial structure that helps different ministries in different transformation and modernization projects. And so we are under the authority of the Ministry of Action and Public Accounts, which is also sitting in the Ministry of Finance and Economics. Yes, it's a bit complex, but this is the French way things work. And so basically in our team, we have 3 cognitive neuroscientists. I'm one of them, and 2 behavioral science interns and 1 policy specialist. And we're currently running 12 projects, which I will present to you in a second. Our mission resembles any type of classic BI team. So basically, the bulk of our activity is really delivering behaviorally informed project and behavioral insights interventions, but we also, of course, try to build evidence for what works. We try to promote a culture of evidence-based policymaking, and we also give advice to different administrations and help them build capacity in applying BI. So nothing very different than a classical BI team within administration. So we work on a wide range of projects, 12 right now. Some of them are on environment, some of them in blue here are on health or prevention, some of them more are on digital service or digital practices, and some are more like on social aspects. So for example, we work on youth employment or encouraging employers to rethink their stereotypes towards disability. So we can go back to this specific slide number 5 later in the questions if you're interested in the projects that we are running in the French team. But given that it's not what I'm going to be talking about today, I'm not going to go into the details of each. But I hope you had a bit of time to just look at the different topics. We can go back to it. Okay, so I'm going to also give you a bit more about my background because it's close to what I'm going to discuss, and you're going to see the approach that I'm going to take in talking about the theoretical basis of BI is also a bit related to my personal background, which is basically I'm a biologist originally and a cognitive neuroscientist. This is what I spent 10 years doing. I'm mainly focused on studying biases in judgment and decision making during my PhD and my postdoc. And I've been since 2016 in my team as an executive advisor. I also teach BI applied to public policy, and I co-teach my class with a person with an evolutionary psychology background. And so all of this you're going to see has brought me to think a lot about what are the theoretical underpinnings of BI? How much does neuroscience contribute to all of this? How much does evolutionary psychology contribute, etc., etc. And before I jump into my talk, finally, I just want to give a small disclaimer. So first of all, these are my personal views. They don't necessarily reflect the views of my colleagues. Some of them do, but not necessarily on. And also, I just wanted to make it clear that this talk might seem slightly provocative. I'm intentionally playing devil's advocate in this talk and engaging in a sort of a self-critical approach. And the main idea is that I'm doing this because I think it would create food for thought and discussion, and I found that this webinar is the right place to engage in these debates, given that most of the time we're talking in a positive way about what we're doing, which is great as well. But sometimes it's also important to take a step back and have a critical approach on the things we very firmly believe in, which is my case. Okay, so after all this long introduction, here we go. I'll be discussing the theoretical underpinnings of behavioral insights, and the take-home message, or the 3 points that I want to bring across in this talk, is that first of all, we might have a selection bias in the behavioral science fields that we draw insights from to make policy recommendations. This is the first thing. Second thing is that this bias, the fact that we have certain fields that are more dominant in drawing insights from, they affect the type of policy recommendations we make, and maybe sometimes they could have an impact on their efficiency. And finally, I'm not going to leave you all with a very negative note and critical, but we're going to also talk about if there's anything we can do about it and what are the solutions to this problem. Okay, so if I had to summarize, if I had to draw in a diagram my job and the job of, I guess, most BI practitioners, I would say that our role is in translating findings from behavioral sciences into behavioral insights. And then once this information is digested and clearly made affordable for use, then we use it to make more effective public policies. So let me give you a very specific example. So imagine I want to talk about, I want to design an intervention and I want to focus on attention. How do I draw the attention of my target population? So we look at different findings in behavioral sciences, different articles, different experimentations that have been done in labs, or for example, with brain imaging techniques that in social psychology or cognitive psychology or neuroscience that study attention. And then my job is to kind of digest this information into a behavioral insight that's easy to understand and to use. So basically summarize this complex information into something clear. For example, the conclusion here would be that our attention is drawn to what is novel and seems relevant to us. And so this is on attention, but as you can see in the mind space, which is one of the early frameworks that drew such behavioral insights, I can draw conclusions on emotions, on priming, on how we're impacted by social norms. And these behavioral insights, I can then use them to suggest an intervention. So for example, as this is an example from the behavioral insights team, but I could say that given the hypothesis that we are attracted by things that are relevant to us and things that are salient, then handwriting someone's name in red, for example, on a letter will get them to open the letter and pay their fines on time, which is exactly what was studied in this experiment. I won't go into it, but it's just to say how I jump from complex behavioral science concepts into easy to digest insights and then into interventions. Okay, until here, I think you're all familiar with all of this. Now, I find that there have been very big efforts and actually quite successful ones in operationalizing BI concepts. So there have been a lot of tools. I only put here some of them, but there have been many, many frameworks that have had a very pragmatic approach in helping organize very complex concepts into manageable tools for policymakers to use, and it has helped a lot in propagating more behaviorally informed public policies. And it's quite impressive to the extent to which these tools have preserved the nuance and complexity of the scientific concepts while still being able to make the information more affordable, more ready to use. This is something that's important to highlight. So there has been a lot of effort done in this specific field. But what I feel has been maybe under discussed or not necessarily, we haven't spent a lot of time talking about it in this domain, is what exactly, so even though we have done a lot of effort in behavioral insights and behavioral intervention part, what exactly do we mean by the behavioral sciences hasn't been the focus of our attention. And actually, I started investigating. I mean, every time I wanted to explain when I do presentations, to explain what do we mean by behavioral science, especially to people who are not familiar with behavioral sciences, it was hard for me to put specific fields, domains that, for example, am I talking about psychology? Am I talking about neuroscience, etc.? And often my response was basically all different fields that study human behavior. So I started looking at a lot of literature to try to characterize behavioral sciences. And interestingly, I came to the same conclusion that it's really hard and it's still up for debate. So for example, if you look at the OECD toolkit, the basic toolkit, which is a very high quality toolkit that I recommend to the listeners of this webinar, in the introduction, there's this quote taken from Robert Le Penny's paper, which is also a very interesting paper that I recommend. And it says that basically there's no universal definition of behavioral science, and mainly it refers to behavioral economics, cognitive and social psychology, the study of decision making, and basically, if we look at the history, so basically everything that came after the dual process theories of human cognition. And so it's still up for debate what we really what we really talk about when we talk about behavioral sciences. So if I had to translate this paragraph into like a figure, I would say that it's when we're talking about behavioral science, we mainly mean behavioral economics, but behavioral economics is maybe an umbrella term to really mean cognitive and social psychology. And specifically when we're studying things like bounded rationality or the way people can have biased judgment of decision making, focusing on things like social norms, loss aversion, all these different biases. So there is a specific focus basically on the domains we draw insights from, and that then we call behavioral economics. And if you look at the different definitions people give in different units or in different papers, sometimes you find traces of cognitive neuroscience, rarely, but sometimes evolutionary psychology, and to a much lesser extent, maybe anthropology, sociology, and things like that. So this is important for the rest of the talk, because I'm going to take this figure and try to take you step by step by how I came to this conclusion that there might be a bias in the way we're doing policy recommendations. Okay, so first of all, the general conclusion so far is that we might be too selective in the fields we draw behavioral insights from. And the dominant fields that have influenced BI have focused on particular aspects of human cognition. This is the first thing I want to discuss. The second is that policy recommendations could be different if we included insights from other fields, and I'm going to give examples. And I'm going also to draw some red flags by saying that some of the findings in these fields are still in their infancy, and it's important to keep that in mind. Okay, let's go through these point by point. So why am I saying that that the dominant fields have focused on particular aspects of human cognition? Because by definition, behavioral economics basically challenges the notion of human rationality. Behavioral economics is basically studying the way in which the different ways in which we depart from Homo economicus or from econs, and it focuses on the ways in which our rationality is limited and biased. So often when you look at behavioral economics, you will often come across lists of the ways in which we are predictably irrational, lists of biases. Sometimes not only focused on biases, but basically on ways in which maybe decisions we make are not completely optimal. This is in a broader sense. So what I'm saying is that the focus of this field is itself on one specific aspect, which is the shortcomings of rationality. The other thing about behavioral economics is that it puts a focus on individual decision making, and I want to argue that this is important because the way we frame questions, the way we ask questions, is influenced by does influence the type of answers we give. So, for example, imagine I'm asking the question, why don't people save for retirement? If I say what biases and cognitive limitations make people adopt such a non-optimal behavior, then I'm going to try to focus on very specific things in this field, trying to find out, mesh out, and basically go hunt all those instances in which we're adopting non-optimal behavior. But if my question is, are there contextual factors that could explain why people don't save for retirement, then maybe my focus is going to be less on individuals, but more on structures. I'm going to take into account socioeconomic factors, etc., etc. So what I'm suggesting is that the questions that are asked in behavioral economics might be biasing the type of responses we are giving in this field. Okay, so let me. This is a claim. It's a claim that needs examples. So let me take you through some examples. Imagine we're looking at teen pregnancies, and this is that we consider it's a problem. Teen pregnancies, especially when they're not chosen, is a problem, and how can we address this issue? Now, the policy assumption with a behavioral economics lens could be that these teen pregnancies are not chosen, and that women would delay their childbearing if they were provided with adequate family planning options. We can consider that it's a non-optimal decision, that maybe these mothers, these teens basically lack information, they lack education, they have a sort of temporal discounting, which makes them look at the immediate benefits of having a child, but not necessarily take into account the challenges, etc., and that maybe they also have a lack of access to contraception. So some of these are not specific, obviously, to behavioral economics. It's just that the idea that it's a non-optimal decision and that it's not chosen, I would say, is more comes more from a behavioral economics type of thinking or lens. In this case, your policy response and what you would recommend to policymakers, and here I'm only giving examples, it could be something different, but along these lines, is to make the information more salient through campaigns, or for example, design interventions in which mothers could expose the challenges of parenting and they can see themselves and hands-on that it's a complex and difficult endeavor, or for example, make access to contraception easier, this type of thing. And actually, the second idea, the idea of exposing mothers to the challenges of parenting, was something that was put into place and recommended. So, for example, there's this program with the infant simulator intervention. So it's a program where they gave dolls, basically, that cry and that need to be fed, and basically like simulating a real baby. And electronically also measuring the reports of mishandling, crying times, etc. And the idea here was that if we run a big randomized control trial and we expose these teens to the challenges of motherhood, then it would help in maybe changing the pregnancy rates by early ages. And interestingly, this randomized control trial, which by the way was replicated several times, didn't achieve its aim. Not only did it not achieve its aim, but it even backfired. So girls with the intervention group were even more likely to experience early pregnancies. And the idea I'm going, like, if we summarize basically the study, is that they didn't find it actually that challenging. On the contrary, it made them want to have children. So this is one example where you're using a specific lens, but it didn't work. Now, it could be that the experiment was not very well designed, even though it was replicated several times with small changes. So they did work on the design to make it better. But maybe one conclusion would be that the underlying assumption that we're making about the behavior is maybe not entirely captured by the behavioral economics framework. So let me show you how we could reframe this, for example, by using insights from evolutionary psychology. So in evolutionary psychology, the idea is basically that ecologies, like the ecologies will produce preferences. So the environment in which we live and in which we have evolved for thousands and thousands of years, 300,000 years as Homo sapiens, has had impacts on our behavior, on our brain architecture, and impacts exactly the decisions we make. So, for example, someone from an evolutionary psychology background could say that, well, present-oriented behaviors are basically contextually appropriate responses, and they're not failures of willpower. And that people from poor backgrounds do not reproduce earlier because they don't understand the cost of their behavior or the benefits of education and the way contraception works, but because they actually have different sets of preferences. So, for example, you could imagine that for teen women living in complicated and harsh conditions, it actually is very rational to have early pregnancies. And so in this case, you would go to recommendations like improving their environment or focusing on socioeconomic factors and working more on the harshness of their environment rather than on the shortcomings of their decision and its optimality. I would go even further, but I just want to show you the complexity, the extent of complexity in which we can go. But for example, if you take insights from cognitive neuroscience this time, you could have cognitive neuroscientists tell you that living in poor conditions or in poverty will decrease your cognitive functions, and it will make it harder for you to think about distant future, and that poverty affects the very early stages of brain development, making it even impossible for you to close the gap compared to others. So your recommendation in this case would be to take into account timing, and that there are time windows for interventions, that they could work in specific, that's very time sensitive, and you need to target brains at very early stages. And if you target them at later stages, then it's going to be very, very hard, and there's almost if I'm going to caricature my argument a bit, there's almost no hope to do anything later. You can, for example, even go in things like life history theory. Life history theory is a specific theory in evolutionary psychology, for example, that goes even further, that says maybe if you're not having any access to resources and you realize that there's higher morbidity or mortality risks, then it triggers actual biological and physiological responses, which will make you want to have children relatively early, and that you will start focusing on quantity over quality. And this is a strategy for you to ensure reproduction. So basically, I'm just ping-ponging between different theories just to show that very different implications can come out from different angles in which we stand. So this is for teen pregnancies, but let's say, for example, reducing sugar consumption. So again, here, if you put yourself in an evolutionary psychology framework, and for example, you take into account the fact that there might be an evolutionary mismatch. So the idea that there is a gap in our tastes. So basically, we evolved in an environment for thousands and thousands of years in which sugar was very scarce. It's a scarce resource. So we developed a liking, appétence in French, for sugar. And in our current modern society, it's very ubiquitous. There's a lot of sugar, a lot of fat, a lot of salt, etc. But we still have this liking. So it's as if there's a mismatch between how fast our cognitive architecture evolved compared to our society. And so, for example, here you could say that failing to eat healthy foods is not necessarily a bad decision-making skill, but it's something that's very determined by how ubiquitous a certain resource is in your environment. And so here again, your policy recommendations would be something like sugar bans or sugar taxes or regulating the amount of sugar in products. And you won't be necessarily focusing on things like information campaigns, because you know that it's going to be very, very hard to change this type of very cabled behavior. Okay, so I think I still have 5 more minutes. So the idea here is that even though they could be complementary, and this is very important, I'm not criticizing one approach over the other approach, and I'm not saying behavioral economics should be replaced by other approaches at all. What I mean to say is that they could be complementary, but they focus on different aspects on human behavior and could reach different views of human cognition. Also, I want to argue, and this we can debate in a bit, they're not neutral, these different theoretical frameworks, and they have an impact on policy recommendations. And I thought that the reason I'm talking about this is we tend to forget this, at least in my context, for example, not necessarily many people have this in mind, so I thought it's a good reminder. A final point I would like to make is that some of the findings which we rely on to make policy recommendations are still in their infancy. And for example, if you take different cognitive biases that have been documented, and some of which, there has been Nobel Prizes, for example, on prospect theory and specifically loss aversion. And since then, a lot of experiments have been done which don't necessarily replicate these findings. If you're interested, there's a long list of very well documented effects or biases that don't replicate on Jason Collins' blog that I'm a fan of. Another thing is that a lot of these experiments are done on weird populations, weird being Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. This means that when you run experiments in labs, you're running your experiments on a specific type of population, and obviously mostly students, because usually this is how it happens. You can pay them, and they're there in the university campus, and they can do your experiments. And so, for example, from a neuroscientific point of view, this could be problematic, because now that we can see that age has a big impact on behavior. For example, some biases are very different in students than in the elderly. So it's important to know how robust these findings that we're using are, and to keep checking to what extent they're being replicated or not. There are also very context-dependent effects. So for example, maybe most of you listening to this webinar know the example of social norms used in hotels, where you tell people that 75% of guests who stay in the hotel reuse their towel, and that this effect is a robust effect that gets people to reuse their towel as opposed to energy saving information or things like that. But for example, if you start digging into each of these experiments that we usually use to talk about this field, you find that they are quite context dependent. For example, this specific study failed to replicate in 5 different contexts. So in this specific slide, what I'm trying to say is that it's important to keep going back and forth and checking that the concepts we're using, to what extent are they robust, to what extent have they been updated by the natural course of science. Okay, so I hope I didn't depress all of you. I'm still very optimistic, and I'm a practitioner of this field, so I completely believe that there's still a lot of things that are extremely important and useful in all of this in this domain, and also there's a lot of things we can do as a community to continue build good concepts for our interventions. I think on the short term, we can consider different theoretical models when we do BI interventions. So for example, we can confront our interventions to cognitive scientists, or for example, to evolutionary psychologists, to see what their different points of views are, and it can only enrich our interventions. Another thing is publication, and publication of results, specifically null results, could be very important because it could show us the shortcomings of our different hypotheses. So this is something that we're trying to do in our team, publish every single experiment, even if it's a null result, and engage partners before starting a project to agree to publish null results. Another thing is monitor results over time, because an effect that could appear to confirm our hypothesis on the short term could on the long run not be exactly what we expected, and that information is very valuable to update our models. On the long term, I think that we need to do more effort in refining our theoretical models and reviewing our frameworks. I think also it's very important to build scientific literacy because, for example, I myself being a scientist, I'm not at all threatened by all these different the replication crisis or all these different findings, because on the contrary, for me, this shows that we can only progress and that we still have a lot of things to figure out to crack the code of human behavior. So I'm not threatened by scientific literacy, by failure. On the contrary, I think it's very, very important, and I think we should try to reframe failure as improvement, because this sometimes in the policy-making world, it can be seen as if you have a replication crisis, then it's a big failure of your domain. But on the contrary, this is something that's very valued in the scientific community. And we can also continue building solid databases of what works and try to compare, because only this can help us draw bigger conclusions on our theoretical models. So I think one thing we can also do about this is create some sort of hybrid structures that take these findings from the field findings and confront them to theory. Because what's happening today is that it's very siloed. Behavioral scientists are in the labs. Behavioral people who work in BI practice are more in firms or in administration and don't necessarily have the time to do this work of back and forth between the field and theory, and maybe hybrid structures. And I believe like places like BIOrg, for example, do this, where you have room to do field work and then confront it to theories and update it, and it can only help us make our models better. And so maybe, I don't know, maybe one day in our lifetime we'll be able to reach a golden framework, which is basically getting all these frameworks to talk and communicate with each other. I'm hopeful, I hope so. But in the meantime, I think that if we really want to defend and continue doing this field in the most robust way, and this is where I'm going to end for today with this quote. I think that, as Nietzsche said, the most perfidious way of harming a cause is defending it with faulty arguments. And I think that the reason I gave this talk today is to open a room for debate of how can we make our arguments better, how can we refine our models. And so I think the floor is for the discussion. So thank you very much for your attention. Sorry, the slide says annex slides, but it's supposed to say thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Mariam. We're now open up for questions. And one of the questions I have is, do you have any thoughts on the importance of the diversity of a BI team? And if you consider it important, what kind of diversity would that be? Like, should it be tailored for each new project?
That's a very interesting question, and we've thought about it a lot. So basically, the way we've thought about it in our team was, so what are it's kind of an incremental way. So what is the most, if you had to bring it to the smallest unit of like one person or two people, what are the profiles? If you had to have more, etc., etc. So I think that, in my opinion, again, this is my personal view, I think that to run a team, you at least need someone who has a background in psychology. So in our team, for example, before having a team of 6, we were only 2, even 1.5, because my colleague was only part-time, and my colleague is a policy specialist. And I thought that it was very important to complement this policy profile with someone who has a background in psychology in general. Now, having a background in psychology means at least you have the skill set to look at experiments, know to what extent they're robust, try to, you know the different theories in psychology, you can differentiate between social psychology, cognitive psychology, etc. Now, the other profiles such as cognitive neuroscience or evolutionary psychology, or more specialized anthropology, for example, I wouldn't say are necessary to have in a team specifically, even though our team has 3 cognitive neuroscientists. But I think that it's interesting to have them in your network. So, for example, once you design an intervention, confronting your intervention with people who have these different specialties could be very enriching. So now, if you look at the different partners we work with, for example, the behavioral insights team has very different types of profiles of people working ranging from psychology to economy to cognitive anthropology even. It happens that in the other partners that we're working with, they have more evolutionary psychologists, so the French consortium I was mentioning. I'm going to remove, sorry, this annex slide thing. I'm going to keep this one because it's a bit nicer. Yeah, the other team we're working with are mainly evolutionary psychologists and economists, but their model is quite interesting. It's basically a consortium of researchers, and depending on the project that we submit to them, they kind of tailor a team that has the most relevant competencies for the project. So I find that model interesting, is to have depending on if you have the possibility, depending on the project, to bring on people from various backgrounds.
Yeah. Another question here is that, do you have any suggestions regarding using technology to build a more of a robust framework, for example, like using technology to reduce bias?
So I would have thought of, when you first asked your question, I directly thought you were talking about using technology or using statistics, for example, machine learning or things like this, to for example, use data from very different papers coming from different frameworks, and then try to mesh out the big. So basically, using technology or machine learning to understand frameworks, and that I think could be very interesting. And I've heard of institutions that are trying to do that, labs that are trying to do that. Now, using technology to reduce bias, for me, would be very interesting, but much more experimental and case by case. So, for example, let me give you an example. For example, medical decision making, I know that there's a specific lab here in France which is starting to think about designing apps that could train doctors to detect biases in different medical cases. Or, for example, even though we know that training on cognitive bias mitigation is complicated, but they're trying to find different ways to see if it could have an impact with feedback or interactive formats where you suggest responses and then it tells you where the bias is and explains to you the logic behind it. It's a bit hard to explain like this online, but there are some apps that help mitigate biases, but it's very case by case. And I think we're a bit far from that. It would be very cool if it happened soon. I would love to see that.
Yeah. Another question is, in a space where practitioners are not necessarily in academia, how do we update the behavioral science literature taking into account all practitioners?
Yeah, so that's a challenge when for example, you are working in a team as a BI practitioner who, especially in small teams where you don't necessarily have time to go and digest all the scientific literature, etc. I think that one thing you could do is try to attend as many maybe conferences or seminars, or try to look at the most updated frameworks there are, because as I was saying at the like initially in my slides, I'm quite impressed by the amount of very, very useful frameworks that keep getting updated. So for example, the last one I'm thinking of is the basic framework, which was done by the OECD in collaboration with Haley Hansen. And I find this framework very, very useful for practitioners who don't necessarily have time to go and look at all the papers, because it's a framework that really nuances and keeps all the complexity of science and digests information in a form that's very unbiased, I feel. So I think it's maybe not the role of BI practitioners in teams. I think it's the role of maybe these hybrid structures that I was suggesting, or maybe the roles of scientists also. It's a divided task in any case, but there are very useful frameworks online. So for example, in our case, we have the luxury of us, almost all of us, except one person, being scientists. So we have an automatic reflex of anytime we want to put forward a new intervention or use a given concept, of directly checking and like checking the latest literature on the topic, making sure it's not it still stands. It's hard when you don't have those profiles in your teams, but you can still read the frameworks that other people do.
Right. Another question is, how would you weigh different policy recommendations coming from different fields?
How would I weigh them? Is that what you said?
Yeah.
So I'm not sure I completely understand what the person means by weighing, but if they mean like, are there some that are more relevant, some that are more important, and some less, then I think it depends on the topic. So of course, the fact that behavioral economics has had the biggest weight, and I think I kind of try to translate the weight with the different sizes of my rectangles.
There we go. Yeah.
So the reason I weight them this way is a bit because this is what every time I try to read the paper to see what's behavioral science really, it's represented behavioral economics and cognitive social psychology, which is another way of saying behavioral economics, I guess, more than other fields. So these are the actual ways, but how would I weigh them, and would I change the size of these rectangles, and do I think one field is more important? I think that it depends on the topic. So there are topics on which, for example, if you're working on something that has to do with a very well ingrained habit change, then I would tend to look more at cognitive neuroscience, in which there's a lot of work being done on habit change, like basically a lot of work trying to characterize by looking at brain imaging, for example, has the person's preferences really changed? And this could be a proxy for saying that, oh yes, so like the habit of the person actually changed. So there's a lot of work on habits being done in cognitive neuroscience, or if I'm working on aging or things that have to do with development, I would look in cognitive neuroscience and developmental psychology. But honestly, it depends on the field. And my personal, like how I would do it is really try to look at what different fields say about the same topic, because it's only enriching to know, for example, if you're talking about stress, typically, it's very interesting to know what psychology says about stress, but it's also extremely interesting to look at what evolutionary psychology says about stress, and that, for example, the fact that stress is a very bodily response that's very, very well adapted to physical dangers, because for a very, very long time in our environment, the dangers were mainly physical. And so maybe the way you would respond to solving a problem like stress is not necessarily only psychological responses, but also maybe sports or something that tackles your body, because it's sort of an embodied cognition. So I would look at different fields and see how each one has something to say.
Right.
Maybe try to come up with my mini golden framework, which I use in my team, but it's not necessarily like standard.
Well, I love it. The other question is, among the 12 projects that are going on in your team right now, I saw like there's a beautiful slide that you made. Could you just tell us a bit more on like the couple of the projects here?
Yes. So basically, before telling you about the project, I just wanted to mention that in our team, so these projects started in 2018, and previous to this, so since 2016, we had a couple of projects going on, but we had a very, very big challenge in evaluation. It was very hard to convince administrations that it's important to run a very robust evaluation of their interventions. So what we did is we ran a call for projects to different administrations and ministries. And one of the criteria to get accepted in our call was to accept an actual like RCT, basically, if we can. Otherwise, a robust evaluation. So this was just to say that the way we picked our topics was not like we didn't choose these topics specifically ourselves, but these topics were submitted by ministries, and on the basis of 35 different topics, we chose these 12 topics, which basically had the criteria that they had to do with behavioral change, that there wasn't like necessarily structural barriers, that they were topics that were very important and in line with governmental priorities. They were topics on which we had data, and also they were topics where ethically there wasn't we didn't have an issue on these topics, that the intention to action a gap was clear and we could do something to change that. So we're working in terms of environment, we're working on creating a consumer information system that displays the repairability of products, and we're trying to test what is the most efficient way to display this information so that it's taken into account in people's purchases of electronics. We're also working on reducing residential wood smoke, so getting people to be more. So here specifically, we're targeting people who use. I don't know how you say in English, le poêle, some like chimneys or anything that has to do with using wood smoke basically in your house. And we're trying to give feedback to these residents with actual captors that are detecting the amount of wood smoke in their household, and getting them to reduce their wood smoke when they're using wood smoke as not as a main source of heating, when they're using it for leisure. We also work on a project on encouraging carpooling. So these are environment. Then we're also working on things that have to do with health. So for example, improving strategies in sleep deprivation in children, reducing antibiotic prescription rates, or encouraging public agents to do more physical activity. We have a project that has just started on reducing screen exposure in children, and also consumer protection. So how do you get people who fall for certain online practices that are there to trick them into maybe making purchases. How do you do consumer protection on that project, on that aspect? Sorry. We're also working on encouraging digital service use for specific administrative procedures. We have 2 projects on employment. One of them is on disabilities towards people with handicaps, and one of them on youth employment and integration. And finally, and this is a project on which we have interesting and massive results, encouraging self-employed entrepreneurs to pay their social contributions online rather than by checks, which was a problem here in France. So I don't know if you have any questions, if anyone has questions about any of these specific topics, but these are the main. Yeah, go.
So no, it's not about a specific one, but is there like a website or something that we can learn more about these projects?
Yes. So what I can do is I can send you the link to our website, and on our website there's a summary of each of these projects. And what we're going to do is, so every time a project is done, so right now we have one that is completed, we're going to publish online the entire study, so with the from A to Z. So as I said, open science and transparency.
Oh, cool.
So you can even like look at the different phases and our findings and solutions, etc., etc.
Great, thanks. I'll post that on our webpage when you send that to me.
Great, perfect.
Okay, I think this is it for the Q&A session. So again, we'd like to thank Mariam for leading the webinar today. A full recording of this webinar will be available at our website by clicking the site tab labeled Events and then clicking the sub-tab labeled Bear Webinar Series. And our next webinar will be March 18th, and we will hear from Ned Welch, adjunct professor and executive in residence at the Rotman School of Management. Thank you all for attending, and you can exit this webinar by closing your WebEx screen.